Hey guys, so let's you and me talk a little bit about autonomous IT management, which is a very fancy term, but in essence, the term that you may or may not have heard about is agile development, DevOps, or basically running a company or a software company in the way it's a little bit of an unconventional way of running a company. Usually, what has been the case historically is that you have a top-down structure where you have a boss and your boss has a boss and your boss's boss has a boss and so forth, and everything comes like from the CTO, CEO, like board level, and trickles down all the way down to you as the programmer who has to build everything. Now, in a flatter structure, which is that you will see at companies such as Google, for example, and other places as well, it's an emerging trend to have basically to allow to have teams that own basically have the responsibility for like certain parts of the product. You don't have like a umbrella level layer of managers who all rule everything and basically have a say in everything. Rather, you have a much flatter structure where smaller teams are in charge, in essence, of managing their team. And I was going to talk to you a little bit about the way that usually works, or rather the way that from my very limited experience working in companies who have that architecture, have that structure, usually pan out, or rather how it is to work there. So let's talk about the benefits first. And usually, like when it comes to having this type of structure, it's very it's very common that the startup scene have something like this. And usually what happens is that each team is a roughly 4 to 8 people. Usually it's a healthy mix between developers, and for the most part, like on paper, the agile methodology or the Scrum way of working is more, you have a certain amount of people like fully in charge of the team, but it's very rarely practical to do that. So what usually happens is that you have a team of designers and UX people and product managers, and virtually, well, the most common case is that since the workload that these people provide, or rather the workload that they have for each team, is much more like it's much smaller, the work packages that they have to deliver every week, it's very common that you share a product manager over several teams, or that you share like UX and designers over several teams. So the programmers are usually the core of the team, because it takes a lot longer to write the code and like develop features than it takes to do most of the other stuff. And then you have operations and so forth. So usually what happens is that DevOps and this architecture goes very hand in hand. So you'll see, like, if you are part of a DevOps team, what usually happens is that you take full ownership of the entire stack. Very often you will run your own environments, and you will manage uptime, and you will be, unfortunately, I'm sorry to say this, on call if that is what's required of you at your job. Now, the thing is, and I speak a little bit from experience here, the thing is that DevOps and this way of working is very, very, very open to interpretation. So if you are unlucky, you will work in a large company who thinks that DevOps means you just get to put all the work that that the operations people usually have, like all those salaries you get to save, because now the developers are doing everything. What usually these larger companies who have a very inflexible working environment and like an architecture that isn't all that developed for like running things in the cloud, and it's not developed to basically do what DevOps is today. Like you run things in containers like Docker and using Kubernetes and all these fancier things, like that kind of go hand in hand with the term. what happens is that you're put in a really like a pretty tough spot. Basically, you're forced to maintain a system that is so unflexible, and you're not allowed to really change much about it because you have a backlog that is 10 years long. Now, for those of you who watched any of my previous videos, you may know which company I've been working for a while, or rather, I'm not working there anymore. But you may know, maybe you suspect that it's a famous ticketing company, where this is actually the case. Where quite literally, like my favorite comment was from my colleague Mark, who said that it's basically like being handed a bag of badgers from the operations team. Like, here's the mess. This is your problem now. And yet somehow our managers, who still, we're DevOps, but hey, we still tell you exactly what to do all the time, and whenever you want to do something, you have to check with us first, because that's the way it should work, right? They're still expecting you to provide to ship as much value. So I don't know really how that works. You give more work to the people who are developing features, and then you ask, why is things taking longer? Go figure, right? But the way it should work is that and this is actually there's a big amount of trust involved in doing something like that, something like this. And it's unconventional that people higher up in the organization to actually give this level of trust. That's why you usually see it in startups and trendier companies, because the people who are in power have worked very hard to get in power, and unfortunately their role and importance in the company gets a little bit mitigated with how DevOps and like these more agile working environments should work. So, because imagine it, like the idea is that you present the roadmap to your teams and you say, these are the features and this is the stuff that we are aiming to ship this quarter. Solve the problem any way you want. Use whatever tech you want. Use whatever present a budget in essence, and you take responsibility. You own it. You run it. All of that stuff. That is a lot of responsibility that you put on your team. It's a lot of trust that you put on the team, and that's a good thing, because the people like Google and other companies have proven that responsibility actually, and the freedom that the teams get through this actually makes for a much more a better product, basically, and a better working environment. So working in such a company is it puts a lot, like it makes you puts you in a situation where you have a lot more freedom, but you always you have to kind of perform as well. So it can go either way. You have more responsibility, but you also have more freedom. So it's a bittersweet type of situation. Like if you like the startup scene and all these things that you kind of come with it, then this is a perfect way of working for you. And I highly recommend, if you want to work this way, where you get to do everything. Like, because you're working as a even if you're in a really large company, you are in essence part of a small startup. Your team is going to work like a startup. It's a great environment. I personally enjoy it a lot. Like I thrive in that environment because I love learning all these new different things and talking to people from different backgrounds who have like expertise that I don't. So I think it's really great. The one thing, and this is not necessarily exclusive to like a platform of working like this, but what I've seen that comes with this is that the way that this works is that what traditionally happened when you have people at the very top hiring and like managing and doing all this stuff is that generally finding new people and like getting people hired was a different type of process. Like in larger companies, like they want to fill a quota for the most part. They need people to be able to do the job. But when you have this more agile working environment, the team is actually is much more responsible for hiring new people, and that manifests itself usually in basically that the team is asked, okay, do you like this candidate here? Do you like him or her? Do you want to work with that person? Like you're much more involved. And what happens there is that if you, I can speak from my own experience, if you are a candidate applying to such a job, they have a very rigorous testing process. You will have to jump through many more hoops, and people are much more picky in particular about you, and they have very high standards in general. Now, I think this is a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. I think it's a little bit of insanity to basically, because this is the way that Google does it. Like, they have one of the toughest hiring processes in the world, and they do so, I argue, because they have that because it's the the gatekeeper principle, basically, where you make sure that everybody who applies gets really rigorously tested, because if they pass all your hard tests, that they are motivated, they really want to work there, and they're very smart. So when they're on the inside, you can trust them implicit, like you can just trust them. You don't have to check up on them anymore. For you already tested them. You know that they passed the bar, right? And this mentality is very healthy, but it's also something that really only works if you have thousands of people in your process. I mean, I was in a hiring process with a company here in Gothenburg who did the exact same thing. They had absolutely ludicrous things that they asked me to do. And at the end of the day, they still only had one candidate left. Like, there were 3 people applying for the position. I know this for a fact. And they virtually were in a situation that this rigorous testing process netted them very little results anyway, because they didn't get anyone, or rather they did finally get somebody in the end. But being really, like, beggars can't be choosers, and that's unfortunately the situation. Like, if you can live without having somebody on your team, or like if you can wait for that perfect candidate, then this works very nicely. But usually I would argue that that's not the case, because when you're trying to hire somebody, depending on your needs, of course, if you're a really large company, you usually need to hire a lot of people, so you can't just wait forever and ever. But if for smaller companies where it's really more important to hire the right person than just hiring somebody, then this is a very well thought out, like, it's a perfect strategy, basically. So what I can tell you about working in this environment from my own experience is that it's very nice. Like, this is perfect for the type of people who really love their profession. Like, if you really love programming and you really love like IT and startups and all that stuff, and like learning and basically messing around with everything, this is a perfect type of company structure for you to work in. On the other hand, if you're more of a family person, and well, not necessarily a family person, but you're more laid, like you feel comfortable in process, and you don't mind so much that things take a little longer, but they always get done right and all that stuff, then this is not so much, I would say, your type of environment, because it's much more chaotic and hectic than the traditional IBM, like super giant company structures. So yeah, this is my take on like the agile work environment and the way it is to work in a DevOps oriented company.